Hello there, friends and sane persons. It's Wednesday, June 1st, and since it's Wednesday, it's time for another episode of Wednesday Whimsy with me, Kyle. As if this is your first time joining us, Wednesday Whimsy is a short show we do every Wednesday where I talk about a board game or a board game related topic. It's supposed to be short. Let's see how we do. But it's always just whatever happened to be on my mind. This week, I don't know where the idea came from. It was just a bit of a whim. We're talking about a type of game called trick-taking games. Now, many people know these games from old classic games like Hearts or Pinochle, that kind of thing. Those aren't going to be on my list. I'm talking about sort of more modern trick-taking games. Interestingly enough, trick-taking games is a type of game that for a long time I thought I did not like. And the reason for that is I didn't love playing Hearts, which was, of course, the first one that I'd ever learned. And I hate playing a game called Tichu, which lots of people loved playing, and that made me think I didn't like this type of game. So I kind of went off on a quest to try and find trick-taking games that I like. And along the way, I found quite a few. So it's a good list. I hope I think most of them are available, or at least reasonably available. And they're great games for a variety of numbers of people, different skill levels, right? I mean, each one's a little bit different, a little bit on its own. But with that said, let's go ahead and jump on in with my number 10. My number 10 is a game that came out in 2013. It is not a looker, I will warn you that. It is a trick-taking game, and it was one of the first games that came out from Quick, Simple, Fun Games. And it's kind of fallen off the radar, I guess, but it is a game called Moons. So what Moons is a very trick-taking game, obviously, since it's on the list. But what you're doing in Moons is you are... Now, let me see if I can find the picture of it here. You have, oh dear. Well, let's try this again. That didn't work. This should work better. Well, looks like I'm having some problems showing you the game. That's all right. I will just talk about it. It says I need to do all kinds of system preferences. Well, that's wonderful. No worries. We will just talk about the games today. I will not show them. Moons is a game where you have moons, and the moons of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, I believe. And what you're doing in this game is you're playing cards, obviously, and you're going to bid 3 cards, and the person who bids the highest card, that's going to be the starting player. And these are the cards that you're able to score. So what this means is that when you play the cards, you're going to, if you win the trick, I believe you get to score a symbol, and you're trying to collect sets of the different symbols and follow certain scoring methods. But if you're able to play offsuit, then the person who plays the lowest offsuit card is going to end up getting a bonus token. And so there's some interesting play here where you're trying to, win the trick so that you get the tokens of the ones that you bid for, and then lose a few, or not lose a few, but bid offsuit when you can, so that you can get, you can kind of double down on certain types of bonus tokens that you're able to get. It's not a very long game. Most trick-taking games aren't very long, which is kind of where they where they thrive. But it's just a very interesting game. This is a very interesting balance between wanting to win, knowing what to win, when to win it. It just really ends up being quite an interesting little game here. And so it's one that I don't know that anybody really talks about anymore, but I really enjoyed and still do and would love to play again with the right people. And that is my number 10, Moons. And let's move on to my number 9. All right, my number 9. I'm going to try this again. I don't know if I'll be able to, but yeah, it's just not working. Well, that's very unfortunate. My number 9 is a game that it's an interesting take on trick-taking. If Ilya were here, he would say it's not a trick-taking game because it has other features involved in it. But the game is called Joraku. And in Joraku, what you're trying to do is you have it's a combination area control and trick taking game. So the cards are going to go 1 through 6, and you're playing the cards, and you're either going to play them for their sort of different effects or for winning the trick, and you're trying to get these soldiers, and you can get them. You want to get them in certain areas so that you have the majority at various points during the game. It's a very stark looking game, not much of a looker at all, really, unfortunately. And I think it's a Japanese publication, so it's been a while since I've even seen it at a store or online. I don't know how easy to get this one is, but it was, I guess, published in the US by Tasty Minstrel, and that means that it's going to be even harder to get. But anyway, it's a very interesting balance between sort of almost like a card-driven game like Twilight Struggle, where you're balancing what you're trying to do with the cards you play, when it's appropriate to win a trick, when it's appropriate to play to sort of build your own kind of majority in these areas, regardless of whether you win or not. It's just a very interesting game, unlike really anything else except an older out-of-print game called Hispaniola, which gives me kind of the same feels, but is very difficult to find. Anyway, Joraku is a really interesting trick-taking game, and if that's what you're in the mood for, it's a nice twist on the system. So let's move on then to number 8. My number 8 is not Joraku. My number 8 is a classic. It is a trick-taking game from way back in the day. It might be the oldest trick-taking game on my list. It looks like it was published in 1997. The game is called David and Goliath. So remember, in a trick-taking game, normally you're playing a suit and then following along. And so in this game, what you're doing is it's sort of the traditional trick-taking genre, but whoever plays the highest card, regardless of the suit, is going to win the trick. But whoever plays the lowest card is going to win the card that the person who played the highest card won. And then you're going to take these cards and kind of organize them by color in front of you. And the way the scoring works is really interesting, because if you have only 1 or 2 cards of a color, then they score their value. So those, I guess, 13 value cards, you don't want a lot of that color. You want to make sure you don't win more than 2. Otherwise, instead of being worth their face value, they're all worth only 1 point each. So there's a really nice balance here between figuring out the right time to play high and take a trick, but that's going to get you a whole bunch of crap that you probably don't want, or play low and try and win just that 1 or 2 key card, those 1 or 2 key cards that you really need for your scoring. It's unlike really anything else, but a nice sort of traditional trick-taking feel. A great game that's been around for a while, although I don't know that I see it played very often anymore. That's kind of a pity, but a really interesting one, David and Goliath. I guess I forgot to show that. There we go. My number 8, David and Goliath. Let's move on to my number 7. My number 7 is, so a couple of years ago, trick-taking games really were always for 3 or more players. But a couple of years ago, a couple of games came out that brought trick-taking down to the 2-player realm. And this is not one of those original ones. This is a newer game in the 2-player trick-taking genre, but it just really became interesting to see how game designers could kind of balance the kind of need to have more cards that you'll see in a larger trick take in a normal trick taking game versus the head-to-head 2-player experience. And one of the more recent games to do that is Jekyll and Hyde. Jekyll and Hyde is a Korean game, and in it, one person is playing the role of Dr. Jekyll, one person is playing the role of Mr. Hyde. Surprise, surprise. And you're trying to sort of vie for dominance within your body. And there's this track, and what Dr. Jekyll wants to do is keep this marker on his side of the track, because if it ever strays into Mr. Hyde's territory, he loses. So Mr. Hyde wants to win quickly. If Jekyll survives 3 rounds, then he wins. And you're going to play, each play a card, and then at the end of the round, at the end of the hand, the deck, you're going to see who won more tricks. And Dr. Jekyll wants to keep things in balance. And so if Mr. Hyde wins or loses a greater number of tricks than Dr. Jekyll, the marker is going to move more toward his side. So there's this interesting balance of trying to win. As Mr. Hyde, you want to either win a lot or lose a lot, and as Dr. Jekyll, you want to win and lose sort of evenly. And it's an interesting. It's a very different experience, whichever side you're playing. There are special abilities and things to focus on with the game too that make it kind of fun and interesting, but really it's this balance between good and evil. No, between order and chaos, and sort of trying to keep things in balance or out of focus that makes the game really interesting and an experience really unlike anything else. So that's my number 7. Let's move on to number 6. Number 6 is probably the newest game on the list, and much like Joraku, this is a trick-taking game that kind of does something else too. So the game came out from Osprey Games last year, I believe, and it is called Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland. You got to love those long names. But Brian Boru is a really interesting trick-taking game because you've got this board and you're trying to control different areas. You're trying to have the most tokens in certain regions. There's a lot of area control. It seems that works well with trick-taking for some reason. But what you're doing, though, is unlike most games, you don't have to follow suit. You're going to play the card that you want, and the highest card, the suited color, is going to define which area is sort of in play. But the winning the trick will mean that you get sort of you win that area. But if you don't win the trick, you get a more powerful action on your card. And so it's an interesting balance between playing the card for its, I want to win this trick function, or for its I need the value of this action function. And it's almost like Furnace in the way that the bidding works in that game, because you don't really ever quite know where you're going to come out. And it's a very interesting concept. I like the area control nature of it. I like that it's more than just playing cards, although playing the cards is still a key portion of it. The theme doesn't really come through, but trick-taking games aren't known for being super thematic. Anyway, it's a beautiful game and a really interesting one. It was quite a nice surprise last year. Number 6, Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland. Let's go on to number 5. All right, number 5, we're getting into some really interesting trick-taking games here. My number 5 is a game that came out a number of years ago. It is just a very plain trick-taking game with a lot of weird twists in it, and that is Skull King. I have trouble remembering the name of the game for some reason, but it really is Skull King. So it looks like it came out in 2013. Okay. But what you're doing in the game is you're going to play 10 rounds, which is honestly a little long. But you're going to bid how many tricks you're going to win. And as long as you win exactly that many, you're going to get a lot of points. If you don't win that many, if you win too many or lose too many, you're going to end up not scoring nearly as well or even losing points. So that's not good. But it's sort of a standard deck of 1 through 13, and you're doing the follow suit thing. But there's also a few special cards. There's some pirates, there's a mermaid, there's a pirate king, and then there's some other cards that let you do interesting things like a flea card that lets you run away, FLEE. So you're using all these abilities, right? You can play these special cards out of suit to try and win or lose a trick when you need to make sure you get the right number. And so you're kind of thinking, okay, am I going to bid high? Am I going to bid low? How are you going to do it? And then there's extra bonuses that you can get. It's a very tense game as you sort of see, okay, this person is on course to hit his or her bid, and so I've got to try and mess that up while still hitting my own. It's a really interesting twist on trick-taking games. I don't usually like the ones where you have to call out your bid, but this one's very different. It's unlike really anything else that there is. It's also very available and widely produced, so that's an extra plus. But it's definitely worth your time if you can find a copy. That's number 5, Skull King. Nothing to do with foxes. All right, next we're going to go on to number 4. Okay, my number four, back in those days when I thought I didn't like trick taking, this was the one. This was the one that kind of pulled me back in and made me think, okay, wait just a moment. Maybe I do enjoy these games. It is a game where, unlike most games where you have to follow suit, in this game you're not allowed to, and that game is Potato Man. So, as I mentioned, in Potato Man there's four colors, and if I play red, then someone else has to play blue, someone else has to play yellow, someone else has to play green. And if you can't play the card, the round ends and you kind of reset. So it's there's not really any of this kind of sloughing to so that you can short suit yourself. It's you have to follow this rule. There's also the yellow cards are very weak, and the red cards are very strong. But if there's a red card in, then the yellow will beat the red. And then when you win a trick, you get to take a scoring card, and the scoring cards are weaker for the red cards and stronger for the yellows because it's respectively easier or more difficult to win a trick. And then if all of the scoring cards are out, then you get into these really good 5-point cards, which are even better. So there's a lot of interesting play in here of using the ability to stop the round if ever you're out of a particular color. You can force a stop of the round so that people don't score a lot of points, but you're also trying to balance that with needing to get win the right number of tricks yourself too. It's just really interesting. The artwork quirky and fun. I would read a Potato Man comic if it were available, but it's really unlike anything else, and it was the game that kind of grabbed me and pulled me back in. So I'm really quite a fan of Potato Man, my number four. And with that, let's move on to number. All right, my number three is a game that most everybody in the board gaming world knows about. Very much a trick-taking game, and all the hotness for the last couple of years. This is The Crew. There are two versions. There's the Quest Planet 9 and the Mission Deep Sea. And of the two, I prefer the newer one, the Mission Deep Sea, just because it has kind of variable missions, and you don't have to read this. You're not really tied to this storybook. There's story in the game, but it's very poorly written and not very interesting at all. In fact, I've tried to read it a few times, and people just kind of tune you out. But what this game is doing is you have a goal, and you're working together. Unlike these other trick-taking games, you're working together to try and accomplish this goal. For example, maybe I have to win the first and the last trick, and so you all know that those are my goals, and you're going to do what you can to enable me to win the first and the last trick without any meaningful communication other than who has the highest trump card, who, and you can communicate about one card in your hand if it's the highest, lowest, or only. So with this sort of non-communication and cooperative aspect, it really makes it a delightful puzzle. And sometimes they can be quite difficult, right? If everybody has a bunch of different goals that just don't work together well, it makes it a really interesting time and a very satisfying experience if you can overcome that and still somehow manage to achieve your goals. It's a great experience. I think it might be a little bit overrated. Some people really love this game. I really like the game, and I'm always happy to play it. It's a great travel game. It's a game that works well with lots of different people, and it's also not even that hard to learn trick taking through the game because you're working together and you can kind of figure out some of those concepts working together to accomplish a goal. I really like The Crew, especially the Mission Deep Sea version, and that's why it's my number three. Let's move on now to number two. So an interesting thing about these topics, like trick-taking games, these aren't games that are ever going to be in my sort of top 25 games that I talk about a lot. And so that makes it kind of fun to talk about some of these. My number two is a great trick-taking game that really kind of came out of nowhere. It's one that I often travel with, one that I love to teach to people. It works well with a bigger group, not really big, but a bigger group. The game is Texas Showdown. So it sounds boring, and if we could see the artwork, it's just cards with bullets being shot through them. But you've got, I don't know, I think like 10 different suits in the game. I don't remember exactly how many, but you've got a bunch of different suits, and your goal is to win the fewest tricks possible. And the way that this is, but what makes it interesting is somebody leads a trick, you have to follow suit. But if you can't follow suit, you can play any card. And then once you've played, so I play a black card and you play a green card, now the next player can play either black or green. And unlike most trick-taking games where the card that's led is the card that's going to win, in this one, at the end of the round, you're going to see which suit has been played the most, regardless of whether it was the one that opened the trick or not. And whoever has the highest card of the trick that was played the most, the suit that was played the most, is going to win that trick. It's a really interesting twist on the puzzle. And it means that you kind of always feel like you've got something to do. And so you've got all these good decisions to make of when to play certain cards. There are some cards that are just really strong, really, really high numbers. But if you're able to sort of shed them at the right time, then you're able to get rid of those as well in a different way than kind of takes place in a normal trick-taking game, just because there's several different suits. And that kind of rule of you don't really know which one's winning at any one time until obviously you're the last player who plays a card. It's a really fun game. It's very fast. The rules are very simple, and I find that people really tend to take a shine to it just because it's the same sort of base as a trick-taking game, but feels really kind of different and special. So that's my number 2, Texas Showdown. Oops. Let's go on now to my number 1. Okay, my number 1 is another one of those 2-player trick-taking games I mentioned earlier. This was, I don't know if it was the first or the second. There's 2 games that came out right about the same time. I think this one was first. There was The Fox in the Forest and this one, which is called Claim. So Claim is a 2-player trick-taking game. You've got a small deck of cards, and you're going to play through the deck essentially twice. You play a card, your opponent follows suit or doesn't, sort of standard trick-taking rules. There are a lot of special abilities that will say, okay, the goblin always is beaten by the dwarf or something like that. There's some that are wild. There's a bunch of different special abilities that kind of come up as the game goes on. But the first round, what you win doesn't really matter, right? You're going to be winning the you're bidding for your hand for the next round. And so you've got sort of a card that comes out, and that's the one you're bidding for on this trick. And so the second half of the game, so you're going to play all the cards once, but what you're doing is you're winning. So in a trick, there's going to be a card that's bid and another card that's kind of face down. And you're bidding either for that face up card or the face down one. Whoever wins the trick will get the face up card. So if there's something terrible out there, you might you might play a card in a way that causes you not to win it, because those cards then come back around and become your hand for the second half of the game. And that second half is where all the scoring happens for the most part. So you're then playing trick-taking, and you're trying to win the cards. And whoever has the most of, I think there's 5 suits, whoever has the most cards of the most suits. So if I had the most of 3 suits and you had the most of 2, I would win. It's a very interesting way. It's hard to describe, but it really starts to make sense after just a round or two. I like all the special abilities. There's also a bunch of expansions which you can take different suits and sub them out for each other. Some of them are more fun than others. Some are kind of duds. But the base game itself is just really clean and fills this. It's unlike anything else. It's this interesting conceptualizing this concept. Well, that was a great sentence of trick-taking games for 2. I think this one did it first, but I know this one did it best. And hey, I'm a sucker for 2-player games. It nearly made my list when I did the top 2-player games as well. It's a great game. It's easy to find, I think, nowadays. I would go for base Claim. Now, be careful, because there's also like this Claim Kingdoms tile laying game or whatever for multiple players. That is terrible. Like 4 out of 10. But regular Claim, the 2-player trick-taking game, and Claim 2 or some of its expansions are really worth your time, especially if you want an interesting trick-taking feel and an interesting 2-player game. And with that, that's the end of my list. So I apologize. I am apparently having technical difficulties with showing the screen, but that's okay. You can look up these games yourself if you're interested in them. They're not all that much to look at, to be honest. There's some interesting art in some of them, but they're mostly just cards or cards on a board in the case of Joraku and Brian Boru. But they're just really, it's an interesting way to get into trick taking. It can be a very satisfying type of game to play because you really feel like, all right, these are my tools. I have to outwit my opponents. And if you win, if it sort of goes your way, it really feels good. Now, sometimes it won't, right? If you're playing a card game, obviously it's possible to get a bad draw. But the way that you use the tools that you're given can really help you feel like you're having a great time in a game. And generally, these games don't last very long. I mean, half an hour or so. So you're able to get a nice, great experience of an enjoyable, strategic, fun game in a shorter amount of time. Oftentimes, they work well with larger groups of people as well. So if you haven't tried trick-taking games, these are some great ones to get into. And if you have, well, hey, let us know what your favorite trick-taking games are as well. That's going to do it for us today. I'm Kyle, and this has been Wednesday Whimsy. We'll see you again next Wednesday. So, bye-bye.